point of personal privilege. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, I have the honor of having a young lady shadow with me today. Emma, if you'll stand up, this is Emma Arbuckle. She is from Elk County. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll start working the KCC budget. Victoria, you need to say anything? Nothing. Okay. So, do we have any questions on the KCC budget? Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would make a motion to pass out the KCC budget favorably for passage.
Second by Dave. The budget's passed out. Next on the agenda, the veterinary examiner's budget hearing.
Good afternoon, committee. As usual, I'll be presenting from the Board of Veterinary Examiners on white paper in front of you. The first thing to know about the Board of Veterinary Examiners is that it is entirely fee funded, so it receives revenue from licensing fees, renewal fees, registration fees for veterinarians, veterinary technicians, and veterinary premises. So that's where it receives its money. And I will turn straight to page 5 of that document in front of you. On page 5, looking at the agency estimate, the agency estimates revised 2022 expenditures of about $354,000, all from the veterinary examiner's fee fund. This is an increase of about $18,000 above the fiscal year 2022 approved amount. And that increase is due to the agency's supplemental requests for bonuses for investigators, increased costs of attorney fees, rent, travel, and office supplies. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on those supplemental requests in a couple of pages, but I just wanted to point out that that's what's driving the increase. The governor's recommendation, still on page 5. The governor recommends 2022 expenditures of $339,000. This is a decrease of about $14,000 below the agency's 2022 revised estimate. And that's because the governor did not recommend those supplemental requests. And again, we'll get into some detail of those. And for this budget, I'm going to move straight to fiscal year 2023 on page 7 because they have supplemental requests across both years. So it's easier to talk about both years at the same time. On page 7, looking at the agency request, the agency estimates revised 2023 expenditures about $351,000, all from the veterinary examiner's fee fund. This is an increase about $15,000 above the fiscal year 2023 approved amount. And again, that increase is due to agency's supplemental requests for attorney fees, rent, travel, and office supplies. Still on page 7, the governor's recommendation is $341,000. This is a decrease of about $10,000 below the agency's 2023 revised estimate. And that's because the governor did not recommend those supplemental requests. And finally, on page 8, we'll get into those supplemental requests that I keep mentioning. On page 8, for fiscal year 2022, the agency requested $5,000 to provide bonuses for their investigator and their inspector, and the governor did not recommend that $5,000. Request number 2, still on page 8. The agency requested about $4,200 in fiscal year 2022 and 2023 for attorney's fees. The agency recently transitioned from utilizing the Office of the Attorney General to utilizing outside counsel, causing an increase in attorney's fees, but the governor did not recommend that funding for either year. Request number 3 on page 8, rent and utilities. The agency requested $2,400 for fiscal year 2022 and $3,000 for fiscal year 2023 for rent and utilities. The agency recently moved locations. At their old location, they did not pay utilities. At this location, they estimated to pay utilities. And so they requested funding to pay for those utilities, and the governor did not recommend that funding. On page 9, On page 9, the agency requested about $2,000 in each year for other contractual services. About $1,700 of that amount is due to increase in travel expenditures for 2 new board members who must travel farther than previous board members. That other contractual services also includes expenditures for OITS, or Office of Information Technology Services fees. The governor did not recommend that funding request. And finally, requests 5 and 6, office supplies and software. The agency requested increased funding to purchase office supplies and software for fiscal year 2023, and the governor did not recommend either one of those requests. And Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions on the Board of Veterinary Examiners budget.
Committee, do you have any questions for Victoria, Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I'm taking a look at these, the supplemental expenditures on page 8, I just had a question. I mean, the investigator and inspector bonus, I can understand that. The attorney's fees, is that something that's already been, do we have contracted? Are these, I mean, they're obviously not incurred, but do we just go back to the Attorney General's office if these are not approved, or what's the process there?
Sure. So since the governor did not recommend that funding, I think Dr. Mark Olson will also comment on it, but they have recently capped the amount of fees for that outside counsel, and they'll use existing resources to still work with that outside counsel rather than going back to the Attorney General. So they do plan to be able to pay for those fees. They'll just live within what is recommended.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Victoria. You always do such a nice job. So quick question for you. You said that this agency is completely fee funded. And so is this just the governor? I mean, so any of these supplemental fees, they don't come out of SGF, they come out of their own budget?
That's correct.
So the governor is telling them what they can do with their own money that's not coming out of SGF? Or is trying to tell them what to do? Recommending?
If you want to phrase it that way. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I have a question. I'm not sure you're the one to answer it, but on their technology, do they share technology services with the rest of the state agencies? Do you know? Is there any communication between them?
So they do utilize the Office of Information Technology Services like a lot of other state agencies do.
Okay,
for
thank
IT
you.
assistance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I noticed that some of this money was for printers and stuff, office equipment for being at home. How many of these agencies still have a lot of folks working from home? I mean, is that an option, or has that been recommended by the governor? Like, what is the rule right now in terms of these staffers working from home or working in the office?
Thank you for the question. To be honest, I wouldn't feel comfortable making like a broad statement to cover every agency. So for the investigator and the inspector in this case, because they travel so much anyway to perform those inspections, to say that they work from home or work in the office is kind of, not very relevant because they travel so much anyway. But sorry, I don't feel comfortable saying whether the executive branch is encouraged to be working from home or be in the office.
Good job, Victoria. Thanks. Next up is Mr. Mark Olson.
Good afternoon. The mission of the Kansas Board of Veterinary Examiners is to promote health, safety, and welfare in regards to the practice of veterinary medicine, which is indeed a privilege to persons possessing the appropriate and personal and professional qualifications specified in the Kansas Veterinary Practice Act. I am Mark Olson. I am the new Executive Director for the Board of Veterinary Examiners, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with this legislative committee our budget for fiscal year 2022 and 2023. I began this new position just on November the 15th, just 3 months ago. I have almost 40 years of experience owning and managing 3 veterinary practices in Western Kansas, and always enjoy working with the accounting and the budgetary process. I have a great interest in the budgetary fiscal process and have worked diligently with my budget analyst and this agency budget that was proposed prior to my employment with the agency. As you can see in our legislative report, in this budget report, the agency had estimated expenditures of a little over $354,000, all from the veterinary examiner's fee fund. The governor recommended our expenditures of $339,000, which is a shortfall of around $14,806. I'm taking appropriate steps to do my best to live within that budget that I inherited when I came to work. Our agency has just signed a new lease for the agency's office space and will no longer be paying utilities. We've cut that expense. Our attorney's fees for legal services were capped for fiscal year 2022, and the proposed travel fees for our board members will be monitored closely to finish out this fiscal year of 2022. These efforts are necessary to be fiscally responsible to our mission and to allow our agency demands involving inspections across the entire state and investigations of complaints to be done in a very timely and efficient manner, as well as be diligent with our day-to-day operations of this agency. The agency in this budget request also had estimated for fiscal year 2023 our expenditures of $351,000 and a few more dollars, all from the veterinary examiner's fee fund. The governor recommended $341,531, all from the veterinary examiner's fee fund, which is a difference of a little over $10,000. I am prepared to take appropriate steps to do my very best to operate the agency within the budget. Understanding that some expenditures have taken place in fiscal year 2022 and having fiscal year 2023 to better prepare for, I believe with my experience and understanding of our present budget that our agency will operate efficiently and effectively. We have oversight over licensures for veterinarians. We take care of registering all the veterinary technicians across the state. We deal with premise inspections on all the facilities that do veterinary services, whether they are brick and mortar or they are mobile or they are ambulatory, as well as deal with any sort of complaint that would come in from the public. We have one investigator, we have one inspector, one office administrative specialist, and myself for a staff of 4. We have 3.8 FTEs. The inspector and the investigator do both work from home. They are in the office as need be, but to answer your question, they do work from home, and the other 2 of us work in the office. And I will yield to the chair for any questions.
Committee? Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When was the move made that put you in a separate facility or a different facility?
The move since I came on, or the move in this report?
The move in this report.
The move in this report took place on June 1st of 2021.
Okay, I'll ask another question after a bit. Just a second.
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Olson, for being here. Can you just step through very quickly the supplemental request? I mean, why, in your words, why do you need the inspector, investigator, and inspector bonus, the attorney fees? Just give us some quick rationale on why you believe you need those supplemental requests.
Those all took place prior to my employment, but to the best of my understanding, the administrative specialist went through 3 different personnel over the last 2 years, and so the investigator and the inspector were called in to do dual roles through that, to carry on the work of the agency would be the quick answer in regards to that. In regards to the legal fees for outside counsel versus using the Attorney General's office, when we have complaints come into our office, we have our investigator do the work. It goes before a probable cause committee. And from there, the probable cause committee determines whether there's violations to the Practice Act or not. If there are violations, we work with our legal counsel to determine what those disciplines should be. And working with the Attorney General's office, my understanding was the Attorney General's office encourages not to discipline anybody. They wouldn't let the agency do their business. And so the agency went and sent a letter to the Attorney General's office. And we had general counsel from AG's office and we had litigation counsel. We asked to keep the same general counsel, is my understanding. Litigation counsel, the board was frustrated. They wanted to carry on the complaint process and deal with hearings. And so they asked to have different counsel, and the AG's office sent a letter that they would terminate their relationship and we'd have to find someone else. Presently, we have outside counsel. We are able to carry on the business very efficiently and very properly and go through the hearing process. If there's disciplines that need to be made, they can be, and we weren't getting that. So that's the second part of your question. In regards to, let's think. Oh, the fees for added expenditures. Our board members live further away presently than they did before. And so if they come in for a meeting, but we're doing some of those meetings virtually to help offset that.
Okay. What are your, just very quick, Mr. Chairman, your board members, what are they compensated?
We have 7 members on our board. 6 of those are veterinarians. And then we have 1 non-veterinary public member. They're all public members, but 6 are veterinarians and 1 is a non-veterinarian.
And what are they compensated for attending board meetings?
All they receive is their mileage.
Just their mileage, not the $35 per board meeting, which we seem to pay a number of them.
They're just receiving their mileage.
Just their mileage.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just follow up with Representative Tatum Lee that I have sort of a problem with a fee-funded agency trying to manage their agency, and we don't need to micromanage you, just my opinion. So we'll see how this budget goes when we work the budget, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as we spoke earlier, my neighbor, because I think I'm a member of your board, and so I got a lot of education from him, and probably some stories that a little gut wrenching. Everybody needs to understand, you guys handle the good drugs, the ones that really work, because if it works good on a horse, it'll really work good on me. So we need some oversight and to take, I knew you'd like that. But my point is, we need the oversight. What you guys handle in the veterinarian business, those are narcotics. Those are things that need to be, and I know there's been some veterinarians in the past that have had some issues, and that's a tough one when you have to go out and discipline your own crew. We're very short on veterinarians in my area. We finally have one. Our last veterinarian had to continue work for another 5 or 10 years because he couldn't find anybody to take over his practice. So I want to do whatever it takes to help you guys. But I think everybody needs to understand those are, you have the good stuff. So anyhow, I know the good stuff. Yeah, if you were an athlete, you'd know that's where you go to get the good stuff. We noticed. Thank you.
Representative Wade.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I am very thankful as a Western Kansas girl who were cattle ranchers and have horses. And where in Western Kansas did you practice?
My first practice was in Oberlin.
Okay.
I grew up out by Herndon on a farm, and my mom still lives out on that farm. I had a practice in Oberlin, I had a practice in Norton, and I had a practice in Hoxie. And through those 38 years, I was privileged to hire 12 veterinarians to work with me. And several of those veterinarians have purchased those 3 practices from me. And so I was the youngest going out, and Now I'm not there, but I'd still do veterinary consulting on a part-time basis, and then I just took this position as the Board of Veterinary Examiners. But I'm very familiar with rural, and I think it's one of the greatest places, and it's
Well,
one of the best kept secrets.
You get west of Salina, the air just gets a little sweeter, I think. I don't know. Quick question for you. Do you, and this isn't about your budget, but I'm just curious to know, because I'm hearing that there is a decrease in the output of large animal veterinarians. Is that true? Are we putting out less large animal veterinarians?
Yeah, so I'll share it in a nutshell. When I went to veterinary school, we had a high percentage that went into large animal and a high percentage that went into small, and it was divided pretty much even across the board. And we've had gender changes also in our profession.
I heard that.
When I went to veterinary school, we were one of the first classes that had females in our class. There was 105 in our class, and I believe we had 25 women and approximately 80 guys. And now that has reversed over the years. And obviously, the concern now is our farms have gotten bigger. We have less agriculture kids to choose from. And so the demand of serving that area is still the same, but we just don't have the pool of applicants that come from that rural background. And so to answer your question, as I was privileged to hire those veterinarians, but did I hire all those from the state of Kansas? I tried. And there was just under half of those that came from the state of Kansas. There was most of them came from Kansas, but they couldn't get into this veterinary school. There weren't enough slots for them to get into, and they went out of state. And when they went out of state, they wanted to come back to Kansas, and they had a chance to. But not everyone, like today, if I applied to veterinary school today, I would have a difficult time getting into veterinary school, because when I went to school, you had to have a 3.0 to a 4.0 GPA. And in undergrad, I was like a 3.6. In vet school, I was a 3.3. To get into veterinary school now, you have to have a 3.9 or a 4.0. And a lot of these farm kids don't do a 3.9 or a 4.0, and they can't get in. So that is some of the things. But we're in a competitive world. Vet schools compete against each other for students, and they want the best of the best. And measuring the best academically versus the best that are out in practice is apples and oranges.
Yeah.
And
I appreciate that response. And my last comment, Mr. Chair, if I might, I always crack up with some of my colleagues across the aisle that we're questioning $14,000, but we heard last week the governor wants to increase a particular budget by 300%, at $195 million to go to education, and I just really believe that, and it's for those reasons that you just stated. We do have a shortage of good vets, especially large animal vets out in my neck of the woods. It's hard to find folks that are coming back to Western Kansas. And yet our state runs on agriculture. It's the largest driver of GDP in our state. So we really need to make sure that whatever tools you need, you have them. Here's my last question, just because I really just don't know. What types of complaints and investigations do you all deal with? I mean, just give me and I apologize, I just don't know what would that look like?
sure. All professions are dealing with impairments, drugs, alcohol, suicides. I want to say like dementia, Alzheimer's. Those things. If there is public, our job is to protect the public. That's one side of our investigations. That's confidential information, and our goal is to get people to the right medical people to get the help that they need to be treated and to be helped. The other side of it is unlicensed practice or practitioners that don't want to follow the law. Unfortunately, every profession most professionals don't need a law. to do their job right, but we have some that don't want to follow the law. And so whether it involves a violation of not having a license, or if they have a complaint, if you bring an animal into me and you don't think this animal is cared for in a proper way and there's something that went wrong, you have the option to file a complaint. We receive between 25 and 75 complaints every year. I would say 2/3 of those don't deal with a violation of the Practice Act, and about 1/3 of them do. It's a low percentage of our business. The biggest part of our business is licensing, premises, veterinarians, and technicians. But our job is to have oversight that the profession, not to protect the profession, but to protect the public. The roughly 3 million people in this state have that the veterinarians that are licensed and the technicians that are registered, that they are following the rules, regulations, and statutes of the Kansas Veterinary Practice Act. And if there's any violation of any of those, then we have the possibility to have discipline against them after a fair investigation process.
Great. Thank you very much. I thought of something. I promise this is really my last one. Does the governor, and maybe you all know, does the governor ever give a reason why she says she doesn't recommend? I mean, does that a formal process that she sends a letter? I do not recommend based on XYZ, or is that just no? Like, do you get to plead your case to her or no?
I have not seen a formal reason why we weren't given that, but I realize her decision was made before I started. One more year, I'll know more about the overall process to better answer your question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your indulgence.
I'll just ask what we were just talking about. Are you hired by the board?
Yes, I am hired by the Board of Veterinary. I'm sorry.
You're not appointed by the governor.
No,
Yeah.
I am hired by the Board of Veterinary Examiners.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
The questions I had, I ask this every year, so it's not because of you or anything new in the world, but like ivermectin. But I always ask, and it's probably in our sheet, I apologize. Were there increases in the number of licenses this year? Do you have, is someone with you?
Yeah, I have that information.
Okay. How many more licenses or less did you do this year?
From fiscal year 2020 to fiscal year 2021, we had a decrease of license renewals by 45, and we had an increase in new licenses by 15 for veterinarians.
Okay, so
it was pretty cool.
45 retire. Or
I don't know the reason.
Or otherwise go away.
That's right.
But you had 15, tell me again, 15%?
We had an increase of 15 new veterinary licenses compared to the prior fiscal year, and we had a decrease in renewals of 45.
So you've had a net loss in service to the area. The other thing that I always check on is how many then are issued to out-of-state veterinarians that can be licensed in Kansas.
The percentage is very close to being 50%. 50% of our licensees live in the state of Kansas or have moved back to Kansas after they've retired that are active in practice, and half of those live out of state that have had a Kansas license have retained it all of their career.
Okay, now out of the numbers you gave me, the 45 and the 15, those were in-state or are they overall?
I don't know the answer to that question. I cannot answer that. I can get back with you on that.
Okay, I've been very concerned about the fact that someone in New York can get a Kansas license and use it to prescribe medicines for their family or others besides animals. That has been one of I've noticed that every year, and that is a pretty high percentage, but then not knowing the people, I don't know if they...
Well, maybe I can help you with this.
But
when I graduated from veterinary school in 1982, I don't know for 2022, this graduating class, but half of the students stayed in the state and half of them went out of the state, but they all got a Kansas license.
Right.
And they have to take a national board and they have to go through that whole process. And it's easier to maintain their license all their career than to work out of state 20 years and come back 20 years later and have to go take the national board again. So that's the reason we have a certain percentage of in-state and out-of-state people, because we have a veterinary school in this state that sends people out of state.
Are there other benefits to owning a license other than just easier in case you ever want to come home? And I mean, are there any other benefits like where you can go and work or?
The privilege to have a veterinary license is earned. You have to graduate from an accredited veterinary school. You have to pass a national examination. You have to be approved, and there are certain standards that have to be met, and so you cannot practice in any state in the United States without a license, and so not anybody can just practice. So that's the number one reason that you need a license.
Two things. So do you keep the license fees? Is that what you operate on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And the second is, what is the rate for out of state this year?
The veterinary license fee for all veterinarians, whether they live in state or out of state, is $100. Yeah. It's
Okay. Well, I do care. We have, I represent Kansas State University where the vet school is. Is that where you went to
That's
school?
where I went. Yes.
Well, and it has changed, and it's, I know the large animals are constantly not enough large animal vets. I've been hearing that for many years.
And out of respect to the veterinary school themselves, it just costs more to do business today than it did back then. And we all agree to that. And to be able to have the income and the revenue to operate the facility, to meet the needs for training veterinarians is all part of that process. It's a balancing act. And so when we bring in more out-of-state applicants, the out-of-state tuition is greater than bringing in-state. And so as legislators look to deal with that, how do we deal with the funding and the needs and satisfy our strong agriculture economy? Those are all pieces that need to be discussed and talked about. And I thank you for your service, for what all of you do.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for the information you gave me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for a second time. Along those lines, I understand that there's a lot more dollars invested in out-of-state tuition, but that doesn't help our needs here in the state of Kansas. And so somehow we need to address that.
I would agree with that, yes.
My real question is that we have we have several that go to AI school or other types of schools and get accredited to do AI and those types of services, but they are not allowed to do that for hire. Is that correct?
Anything that would fit under the Veterinary Practice Act, and it's defined as the practice of veterinary medicine, they can presently do that on their own animals. To do it on other people's animals, they would have to have certification or schooling licensing in order to be able to do that, yes.
So a school licensing is through you, your organization, or through the school that provides that service?
For an AI certificate in this particular situation, there are several AI certified, trained technicians that do that across the state that are not veterinarians that have been properly trained. So there is a protocol to do that.
So they are not charged a fee then to be able to practice?
They're not veterinarians. These are non-veterinary technicians.
Correct, but they are authorized then to perform those services for hire.
The way I understand it, that is correct right now. Yes.
Thank you.
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that we talk about in this committee a lot, and I'm thankful for Representative Baker, who helps to keep me informed of what's going on in the Rural Development Committee. But do you think it would be, and maybe there are already programs that foster getting some of these kids into, just as Representative Carlin said, we're losing these large animal vets. Are there any programs that foster, you get out, kind of like what they do with in the medical field, we'll pay for XYZ of your business or your tuition if you go into being a large animal vet, or to start a practice out, for instance, in Western Kansas. Are there any sort of state programs to, we always talk about rural economic development up here, which always kind of cracks me up because I think it's just a fancy phrase for some of these legislators to feel a little bit better about what we're throwing some money out to Western Kansas. But I'm not sure that money is always put in a place where it actually makes a difference. And so are there programs that would make a difference, or maybe not a program, but maybe you have an idea of something to foster this need, to bring some large animal vets back out west?
Representative Lee, that's a great question. The legislature in 2005 passed the veterinary training program for rural veterinary practitioners, and that allows funding to go to veterinary graduating students to go serve in an underserved population of 35,000 or less in their county, and they would have debt forgiveness toward their student loans in a so-called scholarship if they were willing to serve for 5 years in those areas. There is a bill that's in the House right now that will be heard, I think, later this week to change that format. And to follow up on your comment, appropriations of money, our profession appreciates that coming from the state general fund. I don't think that's the question. How the money is best utilized to build a program that you're asking for to be successful to meet the needs of agriculture is what's being investigated and being explored. And I don't know of any specific that's really set up or working perfectly in regards to that. And I would ask that as we prepare to move appropriations forward, that's one piece of the puzzle. And let's take a look at what the process would be so that it's good for the long haul to not only get students educated, trained to do large animal service, but that they're going to have the tools and the support that they need to make that work moving forward. And I mean, I'm obviously willing to be involved in that process because I've had those 40 years of experience. Prior, it's been a scholarship or money, and how it's functioned or controlled or have an oversight over is what I think we're really looking to try to make better.
Thank you so much. I sure appreciate it. A good vet is key to a team. I grew up, my folks had a backgrounding yard. And so your vet is part of your team. They can make or break you. So thank you very much for testifying today. I appreciate it.
Committee, any more questions for Mark?
I do have a follow-up with Representative Newland. Artificial insemination is taught at a lot of the animal science schools and taught by the technical part to learn how to artificial inseminate. And a lot of people do that on their own animals. There's no problem with that being done in our Practice Act if you work on your own animals. Where it does cross the line is if you're doing it on somebody else's animal and something goes bad, that would be considered potentially the practice of veterinary medicine, and there could be some ramifications there of unlicensed practice. But those people that are trained and have certification and know how to do that properly rarely have problems that way. But hopefully that's maybe a better answer to your question.
Well, I was just really interested if there was a process to be licensed to be able to do that for other people, because there's liability involved with this process if something does go awry.
Not through the Kansas Veterinary Practice Act unless you are a licensed veterinarian or a veterinary technician. If you go to veterinary technician school and you become registered in the state and you want to do artificial insemination, you could do it through our Practice Act that way. But if you are not a licensed veterinarian or a registered veterinary technician, you would not be protected under our act unless you meet one of those two requirements. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Committee, any more questions for Mark? Mark, you did a great job, and I thank you for coming in.
Representative Corbett, I thank you for that.
Thank you. And this will close the hearing on this budget. Next up, we're going to get into the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks budget.
Hello again, committee. All right, so Department of Wildlife and Parks, the white document in front of you. As usual, I like to mention whether an agency receives state general fund or not. Department of Wildlife and Parks does not typically receive state general fund money. There was an exception in fiscal year 2020. The agency received $2 million to assist with state park repairs after the spring 2019 flooding. A little bit of that, about $951,000, carried over into fiscal year 2021. So that was last year. But for 22 and 23, the budgets we're going to look at, there is no state general fund at all. So I just wanted to make that clear. And for the budget, I will turn to page 5. On page 5, looking at the agency estimate, the agency estimates revised 2022 expenditures of $94.9 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $3.7 million above the fiscal year 2022 approved amount. That $3.7 million increase is primarily driven by the agency's supplemental requests, and we'll talk about those in a couple of pages. The governor's recommendation, still on page 5. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2022 revised estimate. I'll move on to fiscal year 2023, which is on page 7. On page 7, the agency request 2023 expenditures of $97.8 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $2.8 million above the fiscal year 2022 revised estimate. The majority of that increase can be found in item number 2 on page 7, capital improvements. The agency is estimating an increase of about $2.7 million for capital improvements. Of that $2.7 million, $1.7 million is from federal funds. And projects include campground improvements, dock and dam repairs, and storage buildings. Still on page 7, the governor's recommendation. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2023 request. And now on page 8, we'll get into those supplemental and enhancement requests. On page 8, request number 1 for the Law Enforcement Division. The agency is requesting about $793,000 for the Law Enforcement Division to purchase record management software and body cameras. Of that $793,000, $535,000 is going to replace the Law Enforcement Division's record management software. The agency notes that its current software is outdated and updates are no longer available. A new system will allow the agency to centralize records and as well as offer a new system for more efficient dispatch and electronic ticketing. About $258,000 of that request is going toward the agency purchasing body cameras and replacing old body cameras. The agency notes that their current cameras, the data is difficult to transfer, so that law enforcement officers physically have to plug in the camera or remove the data physically. This would allow them to more easily upload data from each individual camera. And the governor did concur with that request. I'm still on page 8, request number 2, the land maintenance equipment. The agency is requesting $320,000 in fiscal year 2022 and $200,000 in fiscal year 2023 to purchase land maintenance equipment. And the governor did concur with that request. Moving on to page 9. On page 9, request number 3, park flooding repairs. The agency is requesting $2.7 million in fiscal year 2022 and $450,000 in fiscal year 2023 for state park repairs due to the spring 2019 flooding. The agency notes it continues to work with Fema for federal funds to perform these repairs, but has not yet received any federal funding. And so the agency is requesting to use state funds to more immediately make those repairs, and then they'll request reimbursement from federal funds when the time comes. And the governor did concur with that request. Request number 4 under public affairs. The agency is requesting $24,000 in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 2023. Of that amount, $15,000 is budgeted to allow the agency to produce Spanish language versions of some of its publications. And $9,000 is budgeted for newspaper subscriptions. And the governor did concur with that request. Request number 5, fisheries equipment. The agency is requesting $470,000 to purchase 5 boats and 1 barge in fiscal year 2023. And the governor did concur with that request. Request number 6, aquatic nuisance species management. The agency is requesting $224,000 from the state water plan fund to combat aquatic nuisance species in Kansas lakes and reservoirs. This would be used to purchase scientific equipment to perform that surveys and that management. And the governor did concur with that request. And finally, if you'll turn with me all the way towards the back of the document on page 28 for capital improvements. Looking at page 28, all the way towards the bottom underneath the table, the agency estimates revised capital improvements expenditures of $14.3 million. This is an increase of about $2.7 million above the approved amount, and that's due to that agency's supplemental request for state park repairs that I discussed earlier. And the governor did concur with the agency's 2022 revised capital improvements estimate. And finally, turning to page 29. On page 29 at the top, the agency requests 2023 capital improvements expenditures of $17 million. This is an increase of $2.7 million above the 2022 revised estimate. And that increase is primarily in parks and fish and wildlife maintenance. And again, of that $2.7 million increase, $1.7 million is coming from federal funds. And the governor did concur with the agency's fiscal year 2023 capital improvements request. And the rest of page 29 and on to page 30 is a more detailed description of each of the agency's capital improvements projects, in case you were curious about a specific project. And Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions on Wildlife and Parks' budget.
Committee, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My specific questions back on page 9 with the FEMA money for the park flooding. Are we fairly confident that that's going to be a full reimbursement, or is that application still in? We know that the repairs might cost 2.7, but is there a chance the reimbursement would be different than that?
I'll let if the agency doesn't address that, I'll find out for you, but I'll let them address it first.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry.
You're fine.
Sorry. Any other questions? Victoria, good job. That's a lot going on. So, next on the agenda, Brad, you've got it. Brad Lovelace, Secretary of Wildlife and Parks.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of the committee. I am Brad Lovelace, Secretary of Wildlife and Parks. Our mission with Wildlife and Parks is to conserve and enhance Kansas natural heritage, its wildlife, and its habitats, while striving to provide outdoor recreation opportunities and make Kansas a preeminent destination. Our underlying philosophy is to manage natural systems properly by striking a balance between natural resource integrity and human benefits, such as sport hunting and fishing, camping, land use, outdoor recreation, development. In addition, the department promotes recreational, historic, cultural, and natural advantages of the state and its facilities. Victoria does such a great job that she doesn't leave me much to say, and I'm grateful for that. The one thing I might point out as you're following our budget year to year, there's one change we made in the fiscal year 22 budget for the first time. We had historically, we've had some funds from the federal government that were they would show up, and we lots of times couldn't predict them, and they were put in a special category, and we didn't include those in the budget for many years. But starting in fiscal year 22, we felt like that just didn't achieve the transparency standards that we expect of ourselves. And so we started putting those in. So you may have seen a shift in those years, and Victoria's aware of that, and she can probably explain all that better than I can as far as how it shows up in your materials. But that was our attempt to be more transparent and just share more information with you. And we think that's an improvement, although there's some growing pains associated with that. So I would be glad to talk to you about our supplemental requests or any differences in the budget that you'd like me to address. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today. And thanks for the call back the other day. A couple of questions for you. So this is talking about the law enforcement piece on page 8. Do we sell those cameras then? Are we selling the old ones? Is there going to be any monies generated from the sale of those?
Well, our first step was to share. We have 3 groups of law enforcement officers in our agency. We have a law enforcement division, which they do pure law enforcement, but then we also have public lands and parks that also have law enforcement functions. And so our first step was, as we got these for our law enforcement officers in that division, was to pass those on to the other divisions that didn't have sufficient coverage for those. But you can bet that we are going to market those and try to get some real resale value out of those, anything we have left over.
Okay, perfect. I have a couple of questions, if I might, Mr. Chairman. So the grant program that I had talked to you about that apparently a town in my district had applied for, what's the status of that grant program and where we're at on those funds being released?
So you're referring to the Land and Water Conservation Fund program, which is a great fund. It's administered through our Parks Division, and it's federal money that comes really for recreation. And in your town, I know in my town, Linden, where I live, once I started asking about this, I realized we'd received money over the years. And I dare say we can hardly find a town in Kansas that hasn't received LWCF money over time. Now, your particular project out in Nest City is a big one, right, for a pool. That's more than we often can get from the feds, but it's a well-deserved project, and so we're promoting that heavily. But ball fields, playgrounds, lots of those facilities you see throughout your towns are this LWCF money that comes in, and what we do is try to balance that. Some of that money goes to our parks, but fully half or more goes to small towns, because we realize without that money, they couldn't do a lot of the work that's very important that they want to do.
I'd never even heard of that program, so I didn't know they had done it, but that's interesting that it's, so those aren't COVID funds at all. This is a program that's been going on.
Year after year. The complication, you said, why haven't we got the money yet? And like a lot of things with the federal government, with COVID, it's really created some delays and snafus in how they administer programs. And that's one of them. It's not they're not singling out Kansas. None of the states have gotten those monies at the schedule that we're used to, right? So it's been a change, and we are pushing as hard as we can on them, and they know our communities need it. And if you're ever interested in knowing the kind of projects around your towns, I'd be glad to show you, because I was astounded when I started looking through the list. of these projects across the state. They are everywhere, and it's a really important program.
Well, I sure appreciate you working on that on behalf of all these little towns. My last comment to you would be on page 9, where we talk about this $9,000 for subscriptions to newspapers, so that you can, what does it say? Media monitoring is what to provide media monitoring. Just as something you may or may not know about, the last company that I was involved with, I did a lot of the marketing for that company, and we paid for a subscription through a group called Meltwater. Have you heard of Meltwater? And so it's a lot cheaper than $9,000. It's between $1,800 to $3,000, maybe, depending on how many user licenses you have. But they do the hard work for you. You don't have to have all those subscriptions to those newspapers. They query those, and you can put in what you want to receive, and every morning it's delivered to your inbox. So that might be a way you can save some money to be able to do that. Just a comment to you.
I appreciate that. I've written that down. We'll talk to our public affairs staff about that. We don't have the best description of what all that provides. A big part of it, and since you have a background in marketing, you'll understand this. We're doing programs all the time and trying to get data on what works and what doesn't. And that comes down to hits, number of people that click on it, that then follow up. And so a lot of that money is for those kind of services that do all that for us. They track all those and give us those data so that we can invest our money in the future in things that really work, as opposed to things that aren't working so well. So it's over my head, all the stuff they do, but I will definitely talk to them about Meltwater. I know I've heard them talk about that before. That may be one of the services they use, but they may use additional ones also, but I'll check on that. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Real easy question. How many hatcheries do we have?
Well, I can tell you, we've got Farlington, we've got below Woodson County State Fish and Lake, we've got Milford's kind of our flagship hatchery, we've got Pratt, and then we're out at Meade. So that's 5, I think I counted. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you mentioned law enforcement. How many people do you have dedicated to law enforcement?
In that division.
That's okay. I was not aware that Wildlife and Parks had people that just did law enforcement.
Right. Our law enforcement division, Victoria, you finding that? Is it? I'll give you the exact number.
Yeah, thank you for the question. On page 10 of my document, law enforcement has 90 FTE positions. I will say that doesn't include the natural resources officers that fall under the parks division. So there are some extra. They're replacing, I think, 180 cameras. So I'd probably say there's about 180 natural resources officers, but 90 of them fall under the law enforcement division.
Thanks, Victoria.
So would I know them as game wardens?
So the ones in the law enforcement division, yes, they call themselves game wardens, whereas the others, to Victoria's point, are park rangers, are all law enforcement certified, same certification as highway patrol and everybody else, sheriffs. And then also in our public lands, because they patrol our public lands, that division also has certified officers.
So I know a little bit about wildlife and parks because I've lived on a lake for the last 20 years, and I live by 6,000 acres of water, and I deal with all those wildlife and parks agents all the time. Very high risk jobs.
That's because you're a violator.
I know that. At least I don't own a horse. But anyway, my point is, the world has changed in that job, and one of the big changes we have in our lakes is we need more patrolling on those lakes. Everybody got a computer, and they all see what goes on at other lakes, and now that happens at our lakes. And as those violators come, and those people who try to maintain some sort of semblance, they call for help to oversee that. There's not enough money to get me to come with a gun and try to straighten out that situation that's very confrontational. And I've talked to my law enforcement people over the weekend. I went and visited with 3 of them, and they all make the same request. If they're going to be the police and they got to be the first line of defense on that policing, then we need to compensate them like people who are police. They're barely on the totem pole right now, but we need to take a long, hard look at the compensation for our wildlife and park people. Those guys are out there having to deal. It's tough enough when you deal with situations on wildlife and parks, but when you throw the alcohol factor in there, and boy, I mean, there's a lot of alcohol right now. That's a situation that needs some more help. And I think you're a little short on numbers also.
We are. We're always playing catch up. It is a challenge, and I really appreciate your comments. They're accurate. These folks don't make a lot of money. They're tremendously dedicated men and women we have scattered across Kansas. It's a dangerous line of work when you're approaching people that have guns, legally have guns, right? But they love their work. But to your point, we have a hard time keeping that division staffed because we're working to get more competitive pay wise. We're also working with the Kansas Police and Firefighters Retirement. That would be a big step when you're a law enforcement officer and you're expected to, at 65, be chasing people across a field. That's just not very realistic. And that's why other certified law enforcement officers across the state are eligible for KP&F. We're working toward that. We think that'll be a big recruiting tool as well as a safety tool for us. So that's important. At the same time, we are trying to correct pay deficiencies that we recognize. So we're working hard at that. We made some changes a few years ago to those NRO 1s and 2s, those field officers, to try to improve that. And now it's rippled up, and they're past our first line, second line supervisors in some cases. So it's a difficult circumstance, but we're trying to compensate them better so we can be more competitive as far as attracting them. We are, I will say, however, we're really proud of the folks we have and the work they do.
I also am very proud of those people. I'm very thankful because there's nobody applying for their job. It's after them, it's a real short list. And it's one thing on the wildlife side where you're monitoring the fishing licenses and the hunting license, but this boating and outdoor recreation with the 4-wheelers and all that, that's a whole different game. It's changed more in the last 10 years than it did the last 100. You bring 270 to 500 horsepower boats out. Boy, that's a new deal, and your little fishing boat's going to have a hard time regulating them. But anyhow, I hope we can address some of those shortcomings and keep up the good work. Thank you.
The last thing I would say about that is we are trying to better equip those officers to make their jobs safer and also make them more effective. And that enhancement for law enforcement is, body cameras work both ways, as do dash cams. They help make our folks more accountable, but most of the complaints we have are unfounded, right? And that's our best evidence to say, no, sir, no, ma'am, that didn't happen. Here's the cameras, tape, of that. So that's really important. But that the software system, it may seem awful expensive, but that Smart Cop software system, we're actually able to piggyback on that system that the Highway Patrol already has. So we're saving money because we're working with them on their system. That will enable us to better track our officers when there's an officer down and not responding. That will allow us to track them in ways that we haven't been able to in the past. And in rural areas, as you well know, they get out there and all the law enforcement agencies are working side by side to get things done. And safety is, paramount. So we're working hard to make their jobs safer as we try to do better for compensation.
And Brad, always interesting what's going on in your department. I have a few questions. One, we talked about the police, the policing. Isn't there something in this year's budget to do something with their pensions? Or did we do that last year? Or
Well, we've tried. We haven't been successful at that. But this year, there's an effort. I can't tell you where it stands today because it's changing. But there's an effort with the addition or the recommendation to add some state hospital staff and some corrections staff into Kansas Police and Firefighters Retirement. There's an effort to include us in that.
That's what I'm asking about.
And so, right, that's what we're attempting to do. If they move forward, we'd like to move them forward together and be part of that.
I think it's in the budget somewhere. I think it may be where I read about that, or maybe there's a bill. I don't know. I thought it was out there, and I've supported that always. I don't know that we've ever had a chance to move it forward. Let's see. You had a $2 million increase in administration on page 10. For 22. What's happening there?
So a number of things are going on under that. First, I would say that part of that increase is because we had intentions to do some improvements in 21, but because of COVID, materials weren't available. For instance, I know we have over, let's see, what was it? 377,000 were allocated for truck replacements, but as you all know, you can't get trucks, and so that got delayed and deferred. So that's part of that was kind of COVID related. Secondly, I would say we've made a few changes, tried to make some improvements. We have a person we hired a few years ago to oversee our facilities across the state. Every area you go to, every park, every public lands have people that manage those buildings. But that doesn't mean we always have building expertise. We have a person now who's a certified HVAC and electrician, those kind of talents that we just haven't had in the past. And that person is tasked with doing an overview of the hundreds of buildings we have across the state and coaching local people on doing proactive things like, well, I can tell you on our building here in town today, they're replacing an air conditioner unit. And they knew it was on its last leg instead of waiting until summer, which is what we always would have done in the past, and it would have gone bad. And then we'd have been hustling, trying to get something and paying a premium. Now we're trying to work ahead.
I think I just didn't understand what that line item did.
Yeah,
it's not your pay.
No. Believe me, it's not my pay.
And you didn't hire five new helpers.
Right.
That's what I guess I was just not understanding what was included in administration.
Yeah, in fact, we have reduced senior staffing since I've been here, but we did increase this one position to oversee facilities across the state, and I think that'll more than pay for itself over time. I think that's just good management.
Another thing that was called to my attention was that we had an increase in students in the 9 and 10 on page 16, number of student air rifle participants and the number of archery participants. Well, I guess it's mostly, the air rifle went up. Now, is that proposed or is that actual?
So help me understand where you're at.
Okay, page 16 and line 9 is about number of students and air rifle participants. And I don't know if this is classes or if you've gotten some schools enrolled. I just didn't know how you came from 38 to 500.
Yeah, good question. And I'll tell you, that's the first time I've really looked closely at this line, but I can tell you what it is. This is, we talked the other day with Chairman Corbett about things we're doing to try to increase recruitment of kids into the out-of-door sports, right? And this is one of those. And so we, in 20, you saw we had 38, but it made a big jump, which was great. That's what we're trying to do. So we try to predict what those numbers will be, how many kids will add on year after year. But we hope that we're wrong and we aim low, right? Because we're taking in all the kids that will participate. So we're trying to expand chapters across the state, both for archery in the school, that last number 10 line there, you see, as well as air rifles and schools that actually provide hunter education as part of the curriculum. We're trying to increase all those things because those are things that we know really do increase kids' recruitment into the shooting sports and then into hunting eventually.
And so you're trying to increase it
we promote those programs. We look for advocates in the schools, teachers that are willing to teach those, and then our personnel work with those folks to get those programs started and going. Certainly with hunter education, we provide an important resource for those when it's taught in the classroom as well as outside.
This is air rifle. Is that different from hunter education? I would assume so.
It's different.
Yes, it's beginner kind.
Right. We also have, programs where kids are learning to shoot, trap, and skeet, so with shotguns, right? That's a very popular program that's expanding and really exciting. But it takes, the critical thing is we try to promote those everywhere, but it takes a faculty member who's really interested in that, willing to try it. And then we build on their enthusiasm and kind of grow that program, in district by district.
Two more. One, zebra mussels. How are we doing on zebra mussel elimination?
We think that our program is pretty effective, but I will tell you what we're trying to do is put it in a different gear. I mean, we've been working with education, but the gold standard out there, I wouldn't say gold. Now it's referred to probably as a Chevy, as opposed to a Cadillac, is to have watercraft inspection and decontamination stations scattered around. And so what we're really trying to do with this, we have neighboring states. Colorado spends $4 million a year on this. The money that's spent in this program up to this year has been just our department's money. And so that's trying to keep zebra mussels out of water supplies, for municipal as well as industrial programs, right? But that's all come from our department. This will allow us to expand the program, do those checking stations where when a boat's traveling just about to go into a reservoir that doesn't have zebra mussels, we can do a quick check, make sure they're rinsed out, and make sure they're clean so that they aren't accidentally bringing zebra mussels in when they were fishing in the morning at Council Grove Lake with Representative Baker, and when they're moving out west to go into Scott State Lake in the afternoon, right? So that's the way you stop. The saying is that aquatic nuisance species travel at 55 miles an hour, right? They get moved by people. And so if we can do inspection, decontamination work that we haven't been able to do so far, then we think that'll be a huge step forward to serve, our constituents better and keep those, contained in the reservoirs that they're at presently.
The last question I have is on page 24. You have an $8 million difference in your financing total there. Is that, what we do in 2020 that we're not going to do in 22 or 3?
Let's see.
Page 24 under financing, is this because we bought land or something in 20? $8 million difference.
Right. We've really dropped. Some of that could be land expenditures. I guarantee it's not 8 million. So I'm going to have to check, unless Victoria knows the answer better than I do. I'll have to check and get back to you on that. Our programs are continuing pretty well steady. So sometimes one of the things we've attempted to do is shift our budgeting so that the divisions are more accountable for their expenditures. We used to have shared things like computers and things like that were budgeted in one central location. We felt like that didn't create the accountability we wanted. So we're trying to shift that to the divisions.
Did you get some CARES money or anything in 20?
No, not to account for that difference. So I'll have to check. I apologize. I don't know. Yes, sir. Victoria might know. Go ahead.
I'll keep looking into it as well as the secretary, but just at first glance, 7 million of that increase seems to come from federal funds. So we're talking about the public lands program. And if you look at the financing, $11 million federal funds in 2020, but only 5 million in 22 and 23. So I'll look into it more, but it seems like the majority of the decrease is from decreased federal funds. Sorry, but not CARES money, just other federal funds. Yeah.
Well, I can kind of comment on that. You're aware, as Victoria said at the beginning, we are funded by taking the money that we raise through licenses and then leveraging federal money. When you buy shotgun shells or a boat or a life jacket, that 11% of that goes into federal accounts. That's divvied up among the states that we can potentially get if we can match it with our money. And so those do vary every year because the amount of money that people spend on guns and ammunition, as well as fishing equipment, varies year to year. So those federal funds go up and down, and we can give you those trends for going back since I think 1937 when that program started. And so that varies some. And so some years, like right now, we've seen a jump in the upcoming years on the federal money we should have because of the big COVID sales with guns, right? They were through the roof. And so there's more money available to us. We've got to come up with our match to leverage that, though.
I would guess with COVID, I know people did more outdoor activities,
Right.
and so they would buy more life vests and so,
Right.
so on and so forth. But it is a sizable number. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, real quick, Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to tell the secretary he is right on. I just read an article yesterday. I think ammunition guns are up like billions. I mean, it's like $56 billion or something like that. So those funds should be going up. So let's get all the match we can out of that. And just finally, Brad, I've always been a supporter of paying more for law enforcement, game wardens, and I hope keep us apprised on how the KPNF thing is going, because they need to be in there. They should be with Highway Patrol and get that same retirement benefit.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Representative?
Thank you so much. So a couple questions for you. As a follow-up to the conversation you were having with Sydney, I've thought a lot about the hearing that we had on the bill with the licenses for the kids. And I really liked your comment about the mentorship program. And I just keep thinking about that. And I think, man, that would just be awesome. There's so many hunters, so many fishermen, to mentor some of these kids. So I'd really like for you to, I don't know if somebody's working on a bill or program or something, but I just think what a great way to foster interest. The other thing that I would be curious to know, and you may not know this, so this might be a Victoria question. How many schools are participating in the archery or the trap shooting programs? I see that, I saw these number of students, but I just think, man, I think there would be a lot of kids that would be participating in trap shooting or archery programs if the schools offered them. Do you know how many schools in Kansas we have?
Don't, unless that shows up in our numbers somewhere. I was talking with our education people just the other day, and they told me some of these numbers, but I've lost them already. Victoria, do you have them?
Sure. So I don't, on page 16, number 10, I don't have the number of schools, but I do have the number of students that are participating. So it goes from 10,000 to estimated to be 12,000 in the future. So I can find out the number of schools, but I don't know the number, but that's the number of students.
Right. It would be, I don't know if you've worked with the governor at all. She likes to throw money at education, public education. So I don't know if that would be a way that we could add some rural economic development into our schools somehow, is to set up some programs that would foster, and really what we would be doing is building longevity for hunting and fishing, because it looks like on the information you gave us that our licenses, of course, are decreasing, which we knew that. So that if we start them out young and make it part of the schools, maybe that would help our long-term goals. The other thing I wanted to talk about, were you going to ask about the spots with the lakes? Because if you're not, I'm going to. So when I came to Topeka this year, or and we had Thanksgiving at Milford Lake, which was a very nice lake. I'd not been there. They had a lot of spots closed. And in the summer times, it seems like it's really hard to get a spot. Cedar Bluff is where we try to go most often. Why is it so darn hard to get a spot at these lakes? And then why are we closing them like in the fall and the summer and the winter? Why are we closing these spots? Like they're like, oh, you have to be part of a lottery. That's what Milford Lake had told us in the fall in order to get a spot for camping that weekend.
Yeah. So, a couple things. Can I start with the archery in the schools?
Yes.
Okay. And we'll get to campsites. So archery in the schools program is growing. In fact, we have our state meet in Hutchinson in 2 weekends, right? So I'll be out there. And if you're interested in seeing how many kids and how much excitement there is, how many schools are represented, we'll be out there on that Friday, Saturday in Hutch where they come. It's a state meet. And then once the winners there get to go on and compete in regional tournaments. So pretty exciting and a neat program. But I agree with you. We need to keep growing that. So, and we are working on that. The other comment you made was about rural economic development. We just we commissioned Wichita State to do a study on the impact of our state parks. And we average about 6.8 million visitors a year to our state parks. And that equates to, on average, 287 million in sales related to that. So in terms of rural economic development, most of those places are in rural areas, and it's a big boom to those places. And so we really partner closely with those rural towns. All the ones around Cedar Bluff, I know, are heavily engaged in what's going on at the lake, and we try to complement one another. So it's a big deal. As far as campsites, we've in the spring through fall times, we have been incredibly busy the last few years. The reason why we have so much money in here for maintenance is we have some of our low-lying campgrounds that still haven't been refurbished. We have not. There's a question about how FEMA funds are working. Well, in the past, there was a pretty quick turnaround for FEMA funds, but going back to 2019 when we had that almost year-long flood, FEMA got behind and they haven't caught up. So we are trying to make changes, improvements and corrections to those campgrounds, but we haven't seen any of that FEMA money yet, right? So it's really an unprecedented circumstance for us. We're not used to this, so we're trying to scrape and claw for any money we can come up with because we have campgrounds. We could drive up the road to Perry, and I could show you one right now, one of our most popular campgrounds, because people want to be right next to the water. Those were the ones that were flooded for all those days that year, and so we have asphalt that needs to be replaced. We have electrical circuits that need to be replaced. So a variety of things like that, restrooms that were destroyed. So we have all that work we need to be done. So typically when those places are closed, it's because the repairs are still needed. But I'd be glad to check. I know Cedar Bluff is one of our very, very busy reservoirs, and particularly valued to Western Kansas. I know that, and I've spent quite a bit of time out there. But I'd be glad to check to see why you weren't able to find things. The lottery system is this. We've had such demand for our campsites that we now open up registrations for the next year in December. I think the magic day is December 17th. So if you want a site, you go in and you sign up for it then, and we'll book clear spring, summer, fall, in that one day or a couple days. Still though, we have some campsites that we always reserve on a first come, first served basis to make sure that if somebody just decides at the last minute that they want to come out and try to camp that weekend, they can have a chance of getting a spot because we don't reserve those ahead. But we also have these rotational requirements that you can only reserve for so long before you need to move out and give somebody else a turn. So we're trying everything we can to be more equitable, at the same time to be predictable. So when somebody plans for a family vacation, they know their spot will be there and they can plan around that.
I appreciate that response. Mr. Chairman, last comment, if I may, and this involves you actually. And since we're all friends here, let me just start with that. We're all friends here, but there's a Senate bill right now, 395, and it talks about the Kansas Wildlife and Parks actually stopping them from violating our Fourth Amendment rights. and they have to obtain a search warrant in order to search your property. Last year it failed on the House side. It was probably, for me, the most egregious bill that failed. I was so frustrated with that bill. Though I respect your staff so much and I respect what y'all do and I'm thankful for you, I also respect the Constitution first. And so can you explain to me how you feel, that the department can trample on our Fourth Amendment personal private property rights? I mean, explain it, justify that for me.
Yeah, so first, we absolutely, and let me underline that, absolutely obey the Constitution. Absolutely, right? Our officers have the same rights as any certified law enforcement officer in the state. We don't have special rights, right? We can't demand special things of anybody any more than a highway patrolman can or your county sheriff. So our rights as law enforcement officers are exactly the same, right? And so now, with that being said, okay, what do you want me to respond to? If our rights are exactly the same as the others?
Setting up the surveillance without the property owner
We can't
knowing
do
it.
that. We have a policy that says you have to either have the landowner's permission or a search warrant working with the county attorney, right? That's a policy we have in place already. So we can't do that.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Just real short comment. So I live by those lakes and I go out there all the time. A lot of those lakes are core lakes, and the core in the Tulsa district in Kansas, the 8 lakes in the Tulsa district have essentially been abandoned. So that's not your problem. That's our problem. We have to talk to our state senators and representatives and break their arm again to try to get that money back up here. The money's there. The money's going to other parts of the country, not here. They send money here for agriculture and check the box. Our lakes are a different box. We need to have some money for that. The reservation system at the core level is a real problem when they've shut down so many campsites for the same reasons. They're all underwater. They aren't doing the maintenance. It's a confrontational situation. Once again, we need more alcohol and angry people who can't get their boats to the campsite. So we call the fish and game warden to come over and referee. And it's kind of, you need to come out some weekend on 4th of July, Memorial Day, and I'll give you an education you'll never forget.
That I won't. And you're right. Sometimes people see the core campgrounds and the way they're maintaining those, and they equate those with ours. We do have independent ones, but we try to work together with them as best we can. Thank you.
So it's about time, but before you leave, since it was brought up, this will be off this a little bit, but on that Senate Bill 395, Secretary, if the FBI, chief of police, and sheriff all have to obtain a search warrant, then you would be agreeable and be supportive of 395.
So given the fact we all have the same rights as law enforcement officers, that's already in place.
No, it's not in place.
I beg to differ.
That's okay, but if all the other governing bodies I mentioned above have to obtain a search warrant to come on your property, would you be then supportive of Senate Bill 395?
Well, recognize they don't all have to obtain a search warrant. The open fields doctrine, you're familiar with that, allows law enforcement to go on to properties under certain circumstances, not all circumstances, but certain ones. And so all those things are well tested in the courts, starting with the Constitution, then in the courts, to get to where we are today. And every one of those agencies has the same rights as the other and as us.
So, any questions on today's stuff? It's been spirited. And any questions? Nope. Great job, Secretary, Victoria, and everybody. So, meeting is adjourned. We wore the horse out.